joining us this week. First of all, to introduce myself, my name is Alex Scrivener. I'm the Program Manager at the Eurasia Democratic Security Network. First, I'd just like to welcome everyone here to the latest of our series of panel discussions brought to you by EDSN with the kind support of the National Endowment of Democracy from the US. Now, the subject that we are to be discussing today, namely that of decolonizing Russia, is one that, to put it mildly, has proven rather controversial. In fact, it's provoked quite a few angry reactions from everyone from Russian talk show hosts, which is maybe not surprising, to academics and commentators in the West. Now, of course, it's not surprising that we should be having this conversation about decolonization in Russia now, at this time, in the wake of Russia's terrible aggression against Ukraine. But what is surprising to people, to those of us who are either from the region or have been in the region for a while, is that it's taken so long for this conversation to happen, for this discourse to happen. For, unlike here, the kind of idea of Russia as an empire, as what's happening with Russia and Russia's neighborhood as decolonization is a rather novel idea in the West, whereas in places like Georgia, where I am now in Tbilisi, and any other of the parts of the world that surround Russia or in Russia itself, the idea of Russia as an empire, as an imperial state, is actually quite an established frame. And you'll hear local people around the region refer to Russia in that way. But because it's such a novel concept in the West, it has provoked somewhat of a reaction. And obviously what's happened in Ukraine has really bumped up this kind of conversation up to the top of the agenda, much higher than it was. To which I think I can say, a lot of people from the region would probably say better late than never, but here we are, and then we're having this discussion today, which I think will be very helpful. Now, before I move on and introduce our illustrious speakers, I think I'll just take a minute to sort of clarify the subject a little bit, what we mean by decolonization. So some of the angriest reactions to this discourse have sort of taken to mean rather narrowly nothing short of kind of a total dismemberment or destruction of Russia or breakup of Russia. Now, of course, if nations that are currently within the Russian Federation have a democratic right of self-determination, decide that they want to pursue that kind of path, well, that's a subject that has to be discussed and should be discussed. But decolonization means so much more than that. It's also, for example, about how Russia behaves, how Russia's attitude is as an imperial state towards what's now, I say now, the last 30 years, for those countries that surround it that are now independent, the countries that too many Western commentators rather disparagingly refer to as Russia's backyard, and therefore kind of repeating the Russian colonial discourse. So that's very much part of decolonization, how we talk about the region, how Russia behaves in the region, vis-a-vis the countries that are now not Russia, that were Russia or the Soviet Union in the past. Decolonization is also about self-determination more broadly and about self-expression for those people from cultures and regions and nations that are currently within the Russian Federation. It's about amplifying. It's not just about independence or questions of independence, although it's also that. It's also about amplifying the voices of people from these places whose cultures have been regularly ignored, regularly even erased, not just by Russia, but also by too many people in the West and other countries who just sort of haven't taken seriously what they have to say. And it's happened for far too long. I think decolonization, this discussion that we're going to have today, is part of rectifying that. So decolonization is a very broad subject, and it's something that I think all three of our speakers, all three of whom are from the region, will have a lot to add. And on that note, I would like to introduce our speakers. So firstly, I'll introduce Katsiaryna Shmatsina, who is an independent policy analyst and PhD fellow at Virginia Tech in Washington, DC, specializing in Belarusian foreign policy and Eurasia security. Previously a Rethink CEE Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the US and a researcher at the Belarusian Institute of Strategic Studies. And we also have Leyla Latypova, who is a reporter for the Moscow Times, covering regional and indigenous politics, human rights, and society in Russia. Separate from her main line of work, Leyla engages in research advocacy dedicated to bringing the world's attention to the issues of systemic rights violations against Russia's ethnic minority communities. Leyla is a Volga Tatar, hailing from the Republic of Bashkortostan. And thirdly, we have Ridvan Urcosta, a PhD candidate at the University of Warsaw, and an activist at the Crimean Tatar National Movement. And he works as an analyst at several different European and American think tanks. So before I hand the floor over to the speakers, just give a quick overview of the rules of how this is going to work. I've asked each of the speakers to kind of give us 7-8 minutes of introduction, and that will be followed by Q&A, and any of you will be able to ask questions. Right now, all of you are muted automatically, and you cannot currently request to be unmuted until the speakers are finished. But once they're finished, we've moved on to the Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please use the raise hand icon within Zoom to request that your mic be unmuted, and we will allow you to ask a question. I'd like to add to Deanna, actually, that I can't actually see anyone else. So if you're the only person who can see the hands, so if you could just, if you could be in charge of the recognizing of questions, because I can't do that from the chair, unfortunately. I don't know why. But yes, without further ado, I think I will hand over to Katsiaryna first, if that's okay. And I'd like to just ask you, Katsiaryna, decolonization of Russia, good idea?
Good evening, everyone, and I really appreciate that you took time to dedicate it to this discussion on Friday evening. I will talk about my home country, Belarus, and I would also mention that Belarus often is a missing piece in various discussion about Russia's neighborhood. If it's correct, again, to think about our region as something in Russia's near abroad, so to say. I recall, like, oftentimes you would open a book, anything dedicated to, again, our region, and you would see something like, oh, Belarus is just, well, essentially you would see the hint that Belarus is a puppet, like Belarusian regime is a puppet of Russia, and that's pretty much it, that we are using the Russian language, etc. And then there is not much discussion or research going on. And I think that recent developments, when we see how Belarus is being dragged in Russia's war with Ukraine, and how the Belarusian political crisis is being unresolved, and therefore gives sort of opportunity for Kremlin to use Belarus as a launching pad for further aggression in the region, also to intimidate neighbors, EU neighbors, and other countries in the region. It sort of serves an illustration of how we forget about certain countries and sometimes just exclude them from from our lens through which we look at our region. And I would briefly mention some maybe like historical, make some historical references, starting with Catherine the Great. At least there is an expression attributed to her that when she was talking about the expansion of Russian Empire in her time, so the 18th century, and she was saying that whatever the Russian soldiers didn't accomplish, this would be accomplished or sort of finalized by the Russian priests and teachers. And my homeland have experienced this pretty much like quite intensely, in a sense that Belarus was annexed by Russian Empire at that time, when we were part of Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. And again, like, Belarus has roots, like thousands of like hundreds and if not 1,000 years of history within Lithuanian Polish Commonwealth, and what was called at that time Lithuania. And here is another reference about when we talk about, let's say, what is Rus or Russia, what is the actual historical term behind that, and how much it actually refers to Kievskaya Rus, rather than whatever the Russian Empire then sort of expropriated this term. And I will omit here how exactly Belarusian history was rewritten, or how Belarusian language was deprived from existence, and what repressions were happening on our lands and uprisings. and resistance, which was happening from 18th century up to today. But I would also mention that during the Lukashenko regime, which exists for over 27 years now, when again the course was like of the official Minsk was towards sort of playing games with like integration with Russia. Any study that would question the Russian-Belarusian brotherhood, so to say, was rather forbidden at the level of National Academy of Science or historical like research dedicated to history, and we find ourselves under sort of in the current circumstances where Lukashenko is trading off sovereignty to Moscow. We find ourselves at what we Belarusians tend to call like double occupation, by rather like when decisions are being made in many aspects in Kremlin, and then Lukashenko, when he wants to stay in power, he would just again like trade some aspects of sovereignty, and we don't like those Belarusians who stand for democratic values or national sort of self-determination of Belarus being not part of Russian integration prospects. We tend to consider ourselves again like under occupation at this point. And this is something that the democratic movement, which mostly operates now in exile, is fighting for internationally on international stage, because it gives some sort of like brings more focus to Belarus internationally, and gives some hope for our fight. And again, when I was talking about this, like historical, how history has been rewritten, I would just mention that according to Belarusian independent historians, not for governmental ones, within 300 years of Russian-Belarusian relations, when we were again like part of Russian Empire in one form or another, 70 years, at least 70 years of this, we were fighting in forms of wars and uprisings. But again, like in the official historiography, you won't find that. And also another historical sort of important date that I would mention is the 1863, the uprising of, it was taking place in Poland, Lithuania, and Belarusian lands at the time, the Kalinowski uprising. And then, of course, it was defeated, and then again, like more repressions, and people were deported to Siberia and executed, etc. But the Kalinowski battalion now comprises of Belarusian volunteers who are fighting in Ukraine. And they're taking this name to again show the continuity of the fight against Russia, which takes place in different forms and in different places. Even when currently Belarusians are not able to continue an armed fight on their own land, those volunteers who managed to move to Ukraine and then to join this battalion are continuing this fight in Ukraine, but also for Belarus. I won't take much time at this point, and looking forward to the Q&A session, but I would just mention that if we talk about the prospects of decolonization, I think like it's a little bit sort of like a distant perspective, given that we are now in the midst of war, in the midst of talking and thinking about actual nuclear threats. But I would also, again, like highlight the Belarus role, or the Belarusian crisis in the current war, and would mention that when the Belarusian uprising or Belarusian democratic protest was taking place in 2020, and previously when Belarusians were protesting against further Belarusian integration moves several years earlier, it was quite hard to catch the international attention, and it was hard for the democratic movement of Belarus to get some actual decisive moves on behalf of the West something beyond sanctions or something about actual sensitive sanctions. Why? Because the West simply did not want to agonize Russia over such sort of minor issue as Belarus. Also, not in the least part because Russia is a nuclear power, like possesses nuclear arsenal. And I think now it's a very, again, like timely discussion. And I think we're at the point where like the stakes are so high, and also the stakes, like I think it becomes more and more visible what happens when you, you as an collectively as international community sort of turn a blind eye continuously on the imperialistic ambitions of a sort of not a rising power, but some player which plays. Which doesn't obey doesn't want to follow the liberal international order rules, and rather seeks to undermine those. And again, like what happens if we as an international community tend to think about short-term prospects, how to maybe to diminish this threat, or how to make little trade-offs, or not to sort of agonize these malicious players so that they won't create more troubles in the region. And I'll stop here.
You are muted.
Thank you very much. I was talking to myself. Yes, what was I saying? Yes, Katsiaryna, thank you very much for that. That was a very interesting overview of your perspective from Belarus as a Belarusian. I mean, particularly, when you say, when other Belarusians say as well, we consider ourselves to be under occupation, and the fact that this goes back so far in time is something that I think a lot of people in the West are just missing. And you're right, it's infuriating when they do. So on that note, I would like to invite Ridvan, since you very kindly helped me out with my microphone, which I was muted. Obviously, as someone from a place currently under military occupation by Russia, directly rather than sort of indirectly in the case of Belarus, what's your perspective on this? How does decolonization as a frame? How does this work for you as a Crimean?
Yeah, as a Crimean Tatar, thank you for invitation. And I would start actually as Katsiaryna already said, like a, let's say, historical or philosophical introduction, because one of the most important Russian historian, he said that Russia is a country which is constantly colonizing. So, from other side, I would add that Alexander Etkin, Russian historian, he added that it exists internal colonizing. So we have different types of colonization, like imperialist colonization, when you are taking different territories and incorporating them. But another, like at the second stage, it's another dilemma, how to integrate these people. So, and Katsiaryna already described how it happened in Belarus, and like the very methodology almost the same, and consequences for those who under object of Russian, let's say, repressive machine is like almost the same for every nation which was undertaken by this. So, but at the same time, I would like to start maybe from more theoretical. Does Russia need colonization? Yes, Russia needs colonization. But what we understand under this term, it's already different discussion, because we could speak about different other nations which were colonizing nations, yes, and they changed their attitude towards former colonized people. And or at the same time, de-imperialization, when you have a completely new overview regarding the world and regarding the people, neighboring people. So I think, yes, Russia needs this. It's definitely needs, but at the same time, we think we are witnessing I think it's the biggest challenge. It is Russian nationalism, because for me, it's not only like a directly military war, which is happening right now in Ukraine, since full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but it's identity war. So if we would see like a reflection of de-democratization or authorization, the process of authorization in Russia, it's really reflecting on the situation, what's going on in Ukraine. From the first Maidan until this war, we see that Russian nationalism, it has interdependence with the events which are happening in Ukraine, because Russia doesn't need democracy in Ukraine, doesn't need free Ukraine. It's clear for everyone, particularly in Russia. But what is here is important, and for me, it's like the most nervous element in this entire geopolitical dilemma in Eurasia, that when we speak about decolonization, it is at the same time, we see that Russia needs it, but at the same, from other side, we see the rise of the Russian nationalism. But at the same time, and in other part, it's like when we see, it's like an equation, you know, when we see the rise of the Russian nationalism, it's obvious that the indigenous people which are living currently under the Russian occupation or under the Russian control, they are going to be victims of this process of Russian nationalization or nationalism in general. So why I think they are going to be victims? Because if before they more or less it was like a comfortable situation for both, like Russia pretended that it's not nationalistic state. It didn't take like aggressively, for instance, indigenous people or like a Crimean Tatars or Northern Caucasian people, but in my opinion, and it's my of course hypothesis, but I think that if Russia's nationalism is going to rise, it would ask from indigenous people in Russia, and of course in Crimea, it's particularly visible that they would ask loyalty and total integration into new paradigm. And if Russia would succeed, it would be disastrous for those peoples. I think, for instance, even right now, if we take example of Crimea, yes, the Crimean Tatars witnessed at least 6 immigration cases within last 200 years. And this new one in 21st century, the mobilization and invasion of Ukraine caused, I would say, 6 wave of migration from Crimea. So we were struggling to return to Crimea in 20th century, and now my people is like stretching out in different directions from Crimea, in European Union, Turkey, Georgia, Central Asia, and but we are a very small nation, and we are suffering due to these processes. Why? It's simply because Russia wants loyalty. If you don't support loyalty, you will have consequences, and usually these consequences is real repressions. And I think with this process, of course, if we would take a Crimean case, Russia is really eliminating my nation from Crimea. It's like because what I see because I meet many Crimean Tatars who are passing through Warsaw, through in Poland in general, they spread out and no general strategy where they're going to settle. So this is chaotic move from Crimea. It's create like a total disaster for my people. As I repeat myself, sorry, but it's true. And I think it's not only waits for Crimean Tatars, but for other nations in which are, for instance, more or less like a stable situation in these regions or countries, for instance, in the northern Caucasus or even Tatarstan and Bashkiria, and it's only beginning. So I'm right now. I'm going to be short. So this is my perspective. What's going on with the process of decolonization? So Russia needs to be decolonized. It's not only about like a statehood or like a political entity. It's about general mentality of these people who are living or like presenting pure of this state. I mean, the very Russians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ridvan. You kind of communicated very well the kind of urgency of this problem for the smaller nations who are in this colonization problem. You know, it's not just a sort of nice to have. I mean, for many nations, including Crimean Tatar, this is existential. You know, the fact Russian nationalism is not getting better, it's not moving forward. It's actually getting worse in many ways. And you know, that threat is to small nations. You know, it could be a matter of life or death for those very nations. And I think that's the need for decolonization of the way we look at the problem, but also, as you put it, de-imperialization of the Russian mindset is so urgent. And it's not something we can have the sort of luxury of sitting back in sort of ivory towers in the West and thinking, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we decolonized Russia? That's not the situation at all. But for your nation, for so many others, this is a matter of life and death, and it has to. Things have to happen now to turn this around. So thank you very much, Ridvan, for that perspective. And so thirdly, on that note, I'd like to move on to Leyla. Leyla is from Leyla was born in Bashkortostan and is a Volga Tatar by ancestry, and so can give us a third perspective. So we've heard from Katsiaryna, perspective from an independent country, at least in some sense. Formerly Belarus. We've heard from Ridvan from Crimea, which is under Russian occupation now, and now we can hear from Leyla, who is somewhere which is currently within Russia, and to talk to us about that situation. So Leyla, I guess my question to you is pretty much the same. You know, how urgent is decolonization for you, and how important or useful is this framing to you as someone from as a Tatar from a place currently within the Russian Federation?
Thank you so much, Alex. My answer is short. It's a necessity, and an urgent necessity, the decolonization of Russia. In fact, I think it's the only way forward and the only natural step for all of us who are looking to achieve any kind of stability and peace in this place we call Russia's neighborhood. So I will use this opportunity to address kind of this, the other in this big question of our discussion. In fact, those people who usually call it the provocation, as Alexei pointed out, it's twofold. So first, we hear that from the Kremlin, of course. There have been a lot of interesting remarks made, saying that it's a carefully calculated, policy of the West to destroy Russia, and, there will be bloodshed, it will all fall apart. So I think, the paradox is the very existence of people like me, but moreover, the existence and a growing existence of anti-war, anti-colonization movements within Russia, such as Free Buryatia Foundation, Free Yakutia Foundation. And I think it's very interesting because most of us, most of the members of those grassroots movements, who I personally know, we never aimed to, be politicians or lead this fight. But yet here we are on the front lines and very much disliked by the Kremlin. And the simple reason for that, of course, many of us have witness discrimination on a daily basis while living in Russia, particularly, once you go outside of the so-called your ethnic region, especially in the capital, Moscow, it's unbearable for most of us. A lot of people in Russia have basically an installed radar to identifying the minorities. Even, I'm easily identified. But with invasion, with the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I said it from the very beginning, for the collective Tatar mindset, this was immediately, a colonial war. We all seen it, and the date that we keep coming back to is, of course, 1552. That's the start of Russia's occupation of Tatarstan. We're marking 470 years this year since the bloodshed that was the capture of Kazan. So we keep returning to that date because we remember, we commemorate that every year. So for many of us, joining this fight was a very natural response to support Ukraine and to kind of finally awaken. Now, I think another interesting thing is that as Russia started its partial mobilization, which we know is not really partial, and we have now ever-growing evidence that it disproportionately targets minority communities, more and more people, again, very ordinary people who never thought of doing anything quote-unquote political. In fact, Russia has been working so carefully to depoliticize its society for many, many years now. People decided to join the fight. They're joining the movements. They're coming out to protest. They, find new non-violent forms of protest, online protests, other ways of resisting, and just speaking about those things. Rediscovering their identities, speaking in national languages again. All of those are very, very important forms of resistance. So that's to the Kremlin bit, and now to there are two other collective per se that I would like to address, and it's the so-called Russian liberal opposition, as well as Western scholars alike. Both criticize this the quest for Russian decolonialism. Now, to the Russian liberal opposition, and I don't have to say to the company of Georgians, what Russian liberal opposition, what their imperial mindset is, and how unfortunately deeply it's ingrained. But just last week, because we Tatars commemorated the fall of Kazan, and I had this thought, I actually put it on Twitter. I have asked, why didn't any members of Russian liberal opposition support this, kind of commemoration? It's easy. Put out a tweet. We just asking for solidarity and recognition and a platform. Well, there wasn't anything, and in fact, I was just asked, which commemoration? Why are we just hearing about this now? We have been doing this since 1989, every year on the same day. So I think, my olive branch tactic didn't work. Of course, that was unfortunately to be expected by many of us. And, then to the Western scholars, to their collective, who, many of them have said, and pardon this Orientalist slur that I will use, that if Russia collapses, there will be a lot of unruly Turkmenistans. And to this, I'm going to be very frank with you and say that, of course, even within this big, decolonial movement that is emerging within Russia, we have very different views on what we want our futures to look like. And that is very natural because I have a privilege of being from Russia's largest minority community, and Tatarstan to this day has been fighting, in fact, probably until yesterday when we abolished our constitutional court, have been fighting to preserve, at least some shape or form of our statehood. Now, if Russia is to collapse, Tatarstan will be, of course, in an immensely privileged position. It has very well developed economy. It's quite ready to be self-sustained, independent state, with the exception that we will remain landlocked. Now, my view, of course, on this is not as simple because I grew up in Bashkortostan, and I always highlight it because in Bashkortostan, I'm not an indigenous minority. Tatars are not indigenous peoples. We are still a minority in Bashkortostan. So I have a very different view on that because I recognize that Russian regions are not homogeneous anymore. So here, this very important part of decolonization debate that comes in is that decolonization is also about fostering solidarity between different indigenous communities. And that is very important. We need to care, we need to think about each other. And when building this common future, with or without Russia, we need to consider interests of all those other smaller nations that don't have the same privileges as we do. There are multiple communities, indigenous peoples in the Russian north who are tiny. You know, it's communities of about 100 peoples, and no matter where they live, they will always be a minority. And unless, you know, we fight this broad, you know, colonial mentality, unless we learn, or rather unlearn all of this, you know, message of infighting between ethnicities that Russia has been imposing on us because it is a part of colonial divide and rule strategy. In fact, even between, you know, brotherly Turkic nations like Bashkirs and Tatars, Russia has always been fueling this narrative that we are not the same and we do not belong together. So we need to unlearn that, and there is a lot of work. But I believe we can, and we will not be using strategies of the colonizers if Russia is to collapse. I believe we can negotiate, we can hear each other, and that is very, very big part of this decolonial work. So that is my answer to all the Western academics for now. We will see how the situation develops. Yeah, and I will leave it to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leyla. That was a magnificent overview of the situation for you as a Tatar within Russia. I mean, it's quite amazing the amount of things that you're managing to do from within Russia on that. And yeah, some of the stuff I actually hadn't heard of a lot of unruly Turkmenistans. I've been spared that horror of who said that. Seriously, can I go and, like, I don't know, hit them or something? I don't know. Like, that's an absolutely terrible thing to say. But like that is, you're right. Like, all of us here in this meeting have come across the kind of haughty Western academic who sort of thinks that, thinks in those terms about the region. And, you know, obviously the Russian imperialists themselves, or even the Russian liberals, have problems of their own. So you made an amazing overview of all that. So thank you very much. So at this stage, now we've heard from all three of the speakers, I would like to open this up for Q&A discussion. So if anyone would like, I actually can, Deanna, by the way, see the raised hands. It was my fault I couldn't, so I can see them, so I can select people. So if you could just unmute people that I say should be unmuted, that would be great. And we can get some questions from the audience. So I see Natalie Sabanadze has raised her hand. So Deanna, if you could unmute Natalie so she could ask the question.
Can you hear me? Yes, thank you very much. I have to run, but I didn't want to leave without making a comment, because I think it's a very interesting discussion and something that has been sort of on my mind lately. And I think it's quite interesting that the conversation about decolonization in the context of Russia has come up now as the war is raging. While, interestingly enough, and I teach Russian politics right now, so it's all in my head, it has not really been a conversation at the end of the Soviet collapse. So there was a kind of a recognition that Soviet Union was an empire, right? And a lot of narratives of explanations of the Soviet collapse was of an imperial collapse. But somehow, interestingly enough, it was an empire without colonies, because union republics, and then under union republics, further autonomous republics and so on, in the case of Russia, union republics were never really considered in the Western discourse as colonies. And in many ways, perhaps union republics themselves didn't articulate their position as colonies. So there is something to be explored there, I think. And what interests me is this lack of decolonization lens, so to say, that was never used has also determined Western responses to what was going on in the former Soviet space. So, for example, I mean, if you recall the famous Chicken Kiev speech of Bush, who came and told Ukrainians, you know, freedom and independence is not the same thing, so stay put. Had there been this understanding that actually these republics are colonies, he would have never been able to make that kind of statement. So the lens, basically what I'm trying to get to, the lens is very important. And I think to begin discussion with 30-year delay, but still better late than never, is very important. And I was struck by Belarus and the kind of today's even perception of Belarus being practically still a colony of Russia. So I think this is very interesting. And also, obviously, internal decolonization, where we're looking at the kind of captive nations within Russia. And just to make a remark about the fears that there are among the Western observers, perhaps, you know, we have a very well advanced minority rights framework. Obviously, once you start splitting up, you can never split, you know, into ethnically pure regions or territories or countries, but you know there is an international framework for minority protection that needs to be enforced, obviously. And you know, just as a remark, I have a lot of sympathy for the tragedy of Crimean Tatars that have found themselves mistreated over and over again. And it is also the case which has never really gotten enough attention outside and never been used as a pressure point on Russia. So to sum it up, basically what I was saying is that Russia has managed to get away with an empire without ever paying price for decolonization, neither moral nor material. And I think this is a huge omission, which partly comes from us as well, because we never had that kind of scholarship developed. You know, the kind of, a lot of post-colonial scholarship comes from India, for example, and former colonies. We never developed that ourselves. So that conversation was not triggered by us. And that has had real political consequences on the way the Eurasia and the Eurasian security is being treated. That's all I wanted to say. And I want to thank you very much for an interesting discussion. And unfortunately, I have to leave you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. That was a lot of food for thought there from Natalie. I mean, what I'm getting from you, and I think from all our speakers, actually I think all of us here, there's something we all have in common, you know, whether, you know, in Belarus and you're dealing with Lukashenko, whether you're Natalie or I in Tbilisi and we're sort of from the Georgian perspective, whether Leyla within Tatarstan, or Bashkortostan, and you know, all of it, or Ridvan, you know, in Ukraine, like all of us, the thing we have in common is this sort of seething anger and bitterness a little bit, not in the bad way, but that feel like we've been left behind by the decolonization discourse, that we hear a lot about decolonization in other parts of the world. And somehow Russia, as Natalie just said, has got away with having the biggest territorial empire in the world and has had to pay none of the price, or very little of the price, morally, rhetorically, that the other countries that had colonial empires had to pay. And not only that, it's only now that we're sort of forcing this issue onto the agenda. And it's very frustrating for all of us, you know, and that's what I'm feeling from Natalie's contribution and from all of your contributions at the same time, you know. And so I guess I open it up to the three speakers. How would you like to respond to that?
I can take that first if there are no takers. Well, yeah, speaking of this, you know, bitterness and the anger, you know, for me, that stems also from the fact that Russia has been very openly targeting the minorities within the country for the past 20 years. You know, even prior to the annexation of Crimea in 2014, you know, we've seen it to all this, what before, you know, in this Russian federalism were kind of the powerhouses. In fact, like Tatarstan and Bashkortostan were the two, but slowly but surely, Russia got rid of federal agreements, and kind of just together with federalism moved to abolish rights of minorities. In 2017, Tatars were taking away the right to study the national language at school. And that happened to all other minority communities before. A lot of languages in Russia are dying out, and that is direct consequence of complete inaction. Even though, it has been happening out in the open, Kremlin never tried to, even conceal that at the very least. So, yeah, I think, that's where my anger stems from, because we have seen this kind of build up to this colonial war for many, many, many years. In fact, just on the eve of the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Kremlin moved on to abolish Tatarstan's Tatarstan's presidency. At the time, a lot of people were saying, oh, why is that happening? Why does that matter? I mean, now we know that an empire can only have one president. It would be, of course, ridiculous if someone over there, would be challenging Putin's authority. So those are very little things. They cannot in no way compare to the bloodshed Russia is orchestrating in Ukraine right now. But, those were kind of the little signs and pointers that maybe if, the international community have taken those things just a little bit more seriously, maybe things wouldn't be as severe right now.
Thank you very much, Leyla. Let's I'll ask the other two speakers if you want to respond to that. Either of you.
Maybe I would offer some reflections that things are complicated by the fact that Russia possesses a gang nuclear arsenal and is behaving as a sort of hungry rival internationally, acting sort of in a malicious manner, challenging the status quo and the liberal international order. And I would say that, like, I'm not offering here to dive deep into, let's say, like China's history and what is happening over there, and whether, let's say, people residing in China feel similar sort of sentiments, and who would want to sort of exit the Chinese state and have their own, let's say. But what I'm saying is that I think now in current given Russia, like current Moscow's ambitions, I think we find ourselves sort of at a stalemate with the prospect what would happen with like in our neighborhood. And again, speaking about Belarus, I don't see a optimistic prospect for Belarusian democracy, Belarusian independence, until the Moscow has its ability to keep grip specifically on Belarus. And what I mean by that is that even the victory of Ukraine in the war, assuming it happens, it doesn't mean that things happen, like things improve for my country. And what I mean by that is that in a potential, let's say, peace talks between Ukraine and the Western partners on one side and Russia on the other, assuming again that Russia is exhausted and or defeated explicitly, or exhausted enough to have the peace talks, Belarus could easily stay a bargaining chip in this kind of talks, and we are doomed, like Belarusians, until Kremlin is specifically able to keep Belarus in its orbit. Even, like, let's say, like weakened Russia, if they lose everything else, all other leverages, but still able to keep Belarus in its orbit. And again, I think things are complicated by this, like nuclear talks and the questions what happens if Russia escalates. And I would also mention that certain war games before, like maybe conducted in 5 years ago, like Pentagon gone like war game scenarios, they were considering an actual strike on Belarus in case of Russia's like more assertive moves in the region and Russia threatening broader region. So again, like I will try not to, like I'm trying not to sound overly dramatic here and not to bring like very gloomy prospects, but I don't have good scenarios for now. Sorry for that.
I just would like to add regarding like for instance, exactly right after the February Revolution, not October Revolution, in 1917, in Russian Empire, we should take into account that it was everything intertwined, because, for instance, if we take into account the national intelligentsia of Tatarstan in that period, or national intelligentsia of Crimea, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, all other Ukraine. So you would see that the level of Russian intelligentsia in general, or liberal or orientated intelligentsia, was very advanced. So that's why it was intertwined. I mean, like, let's say those people who wanted to change Russia were quite strong and managed to conduct a revolution. So it's first my point. Second point is like a factor of war, because Russo-Japanese war had definitely direct implications on the first attempt of revolution in Russia in 1905. So if we try to understand what's going on right now, first, if we take war impact, definitely the defeat of Russians in Ukraine would have tremendous repercussions for Russian political regime. I mean, Putin's regime. It's definitely. Second, it's like actually it's very weak. The very essence of the Russian liberal movement. I mean, so why we should search something unique? What actually Leyla pointed out, that we responsible what happened. I mean, the indigenous people of Russia responsible what happened in right now with them, because they didn't act all these 30 years. So the same about the general, like a mainstream Russian liberal movement. It was weak and defeated. So that's why I'm making some comparisons. But at the same time, I still remain optimistic regarding the future, because this potential which indigenous people are carrying right now in Russia, it is not exhausted. It's definitely, it is not exhausted. And but at the same time, when we think about future of decolonized Russia, we could, for instance, one scenario, it's like as Great Britain has, yes, they have several indigenous people who are living together with them, but at the same time they more or less satisfied with current situation. More or less, I say, but it's completely different situation when in Russia. Another scenario, it's like an independence case, yes. For instance, for Northern Caucasus, for Western Siberia. It is important. I think it should be taken into account, because when it starts, if you don't have some plan, or at least imaginary plan, it would be chaos. That's why the things we should work on this direction. I think it's I mean, like for those people who really cares about this, for instance, Crimean Tatars and other indigenous people, we should work on this direction. But from other side, from the a grand perspective, it should be like a general understanding that if it's something going to start, it shouldn't be chaos. Otherwise, it's this avalanche will destroy all these small nations, you know. That's why it should be very carefully elaborated. And finally, I'm finishing. It is quite common idea that, From Crimea it started, and in Crimea it should stop. So I agree with this point, because right now Russia is controlling Crimea. Russia is controlling the Crimean Tatars, the major part of them. So Ukraine should elaborate, because recently Ukraine recognized Republic of Ichkeria. So it is interesting move, but at the same time, it should be Ukraine should be make some very important moves in direction of Crimean Tatars in Crimea. I mean, like recognize the Crimean Tatar autonomy, or of course it shouldn't be like a totally nationalistic, but at least that the Crimean Tatars should be satisfied. So it is a message for new post Putin's Russia, you know, in my opinion, because without Ukraine, nobody would nobody will so engaged in the future of post Putin's Russia as Ukraine, in my opinion. Of course, together with the West. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ridvan. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting stuff that's been said, actually. You said, especially around the danger of sort of minorities, I suppose, nations within Russia leading the rebellion, because then, you know, if there's no support within Russians themselves, you know, it's not fair, as I think some Western kind of observers from their armchairs seem to sort of think sometimes, that why don't they just rebel? There's kind of this feeling sometimes, you know, and as you very rightly kind of articulate, it's not as easy as that, and the stakes are enormous, you know, and they are rebelling as well, but like, you know, not in ways that certain Western commentators need to see for some reason. And yeah, and I see there's another thread throughout. I think all three of you have the same sort of frustration we do too with sort of liberals, especially Russian liberals. You know, and it's one thing hearing the same Russian imperialist tropes from, you know, some, to use the colloquial term, some vatnik, you know, but to hear it from so-called Russian liberals who really should know better, right? Or even not just Russian liberals, you know, liberals in the West, you know, it is another thing altogether, you know. And I suppose I would say, you know, we've known a bit longer in the West. And I think in the East as well, we're fast learning that sometimes liberals can be rather overrated. And especially, unfortunately, that's the case with a large proportion of Russian liberals at the moment, who with slightly politer language, repeat the same colonialist imperialist tropes. And yeah, just to go back as well to what Katsiaryna said about Belarus, you know, it's a really interesting point that's not made enough, actually. Like, what happens if Ukraine wins? You know, what happens to Belarus? You know, no one really thinks, like, could Belarus even lose either way? You know, is Belarus in a lose-lose position? You know, does the West treat Belarus as one of the baddies, when in fact the people of Belarus are just in a very similar situation to all the rest of us? You know, and it's not fair or just to sort of, you know, reduce the status of Belarus as some kind of bargaining chip, or even worse, you know, to punish Belarus for having this dictator in charge, effectively a colonial governor, I think, to borrow what you were saying, Katsiaryna. So, you know, there's really, really interesting points you guys all made. So on that note, I'll open it up to any further questions from the audience. So if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand now. And yeah, by the way, you can always raise your hand at any point. Like if you suddenly have, you know, it's just we won't stop for you. But like when we get to a point where we can accept questions, it gives us some indication of whether there's one coming. No one? Well, if not, then I can ask a question, I guess, while everyone else is thinking about what they want to ask. I mean, we talk about decolonization as a frame that we sort of hear a lot, and we're kind of adapting from, you know, the original decolonization, I guess, the 50s, 60s, 70s decolonization from the Western European empires, you know, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the French imperial domains in Africa and so forth. And that's the kind of model that we're kind of trying to associate ourselves with, you know. I guess the question is, how do we do that? Because a lot of the people who talk most about decolonization now in the kind of African, Asian, Latin American context tend to be, within sort of the general frame of the progressive kind of world, you know, the left, you know, socialists or whatever. And and people from these countries as well. So people from India, people from Africa, Latin America. And I think what's been really striking, actually, until very recently, I think even now, is the sort of lack of solidarity that our decolonization struggle has elicited from some of who should be our best friends. People, who are struggling against decolonization in Africa, in Asia, people from India, as I think Natalie said, like a lot of the decolonization expertise comes from India, because of their, very famous and very strong decolonization struggle against the British. Where are the voices from these countries supporting us? And maybe it's because they just, maybe how do we associate ourselves? Are there lessons that we can learn from their struggles? Are there lessons that, for example, we in our region can learn from India, learn from the African decolonization struggles? Are there voices, that can be heard from these other contexts that are applicable for our own situation? Like, is there, I guess my question to all three of you is there scope, or have we thought about, strengthening our ties, our, intellectual or even, other ties with these places, who've been through something similar with another world power? What lessons do we think are applicable for our situation from say India or wherever?
I would say that like my first idea is that I think we live in a very dynamically changing world, and maybe like the historical memory is out there, but I would assume that each of these countries are occupied with their own affairs and with the new sort of dynamics and new challenges. What I mean, let's say like by the India could be occupied now more with the rise of China and the threats it poses, and then like some of let's say like India or the other neighbors could look at ways how to even partner with Russia on issues of, let's say, arms trade, and again like seeking ways how to rebalance Chinese influence, or again like if we look at African countries, again some of them could be deeply engaging in China's development offers through Belt and Road Initiative and similar development projects. And again, like some countries could be seeing US as a threat and also looking for other partners to sort of rebalance this influence. And I'm not jumping here to conclusions or trying to overgeneralize, but my first idea is that, again, like the memory of something that was happening, what was actual for those states, let's say, I don't know, like 40, 50 years ago, could not be relevant, like necessarily relevant at the moment, and they could be moving on. And here I would again bring the example of the Baltic states and Belarus. So at one point, they, let's say maybe prior to Belarus being involved in an aggression towards Ukraine, Baltic states were much more friendly towards Belarus and the Belarusian democratic activists, and were much more open about sharing how we got away from Russia when we could, how we secured our place at NATO and EU membership, and this is how our resistance was happening. Like let's say, like Poland with Solidarność movement and others, and now we're sort of alienated, and because things are like there are more pressing issues on the table, and there is not so much talk about again like making those historical references, and yeah, unfortunately, like there are other more pressing and more severe issues right now.
Thank you, Katsiaryna. Go on, Ridvan. Go first. Yeah.
Okay. A short comment. I think it's like we have a different different backgrounds, because it's very sensitive question what you asked, because for some people's let's say in Russia, you can really use the pattern of Africa, or pattern of like from the south or something. Instance for Kenyans and Belarusian. I mean, like like a category, I would say. It is category expression, in my opinion. For instance, Tatars or Crimeans, like where it, for instance, administration, the very process of, is it connection?
Yeah, Ridvan, we've got a bit of a problem with your connection, I'm afraid. We can hear sort of maybe 30% of what you're saying.
Sorry, proceed. Let's.
Yeah, maybe if you can, if your connection improves, we can come back to you. So I don't know if we can ask Leyla to jump in now and then come back to you and say what you were just saying, because I don't think if it was like for everyone like it was for me, I heard only a small part of that. So so maybe go to Leyla, and if your connection improves, then we can come back.
Sure. I mean, you know, this is a very kind of scholarly oriented question, so I will just take it there. Yeah, you know, I think first of all, and we touched on it already, you know, the Russia as a colony has that, you know, it has never been, that lens has never been used. So naturally, I think there has been little, you know, idea of cooperation between scholars of empire, you know, different empires, and scholars of the so-called, you know, Russia and Eurasia region. So that's just natural. We see now that that is changing, you know, and we can take a lot from the scholarship, of course, on former colonial movements. Now, you know, for me, I, as a political scientist, I engage on a lot of work looking at social movements through the prism of nonviolence. Now, just to, you know, preclude any raised eyebrows, I do not think Ukrainians should use nonviolence to, you know, respond to Russian aggression. That's nonsense. I've heard some of those things. That's how some perceive nonviolence. I'm speaking in particular about social movements, you know, and nonviolent theories, for example, those developed by Jean Sharp, they give a very interesting perspective for what can be used when we speak about decolonization. You know, it's a very particular way of looking at the state, at the structures of power that it has. And there are some very important techniques, and Ridvan pointed out already, you know, how that we cannot always use violence given, you know, where the small nations are within Russia. So, you know, that just gives us a good, you know, toolkit that we can kind of look at and also analyze what is happening right now and what effects it might have on the, you know, future of decolonization. Now, here I will also say that when I praise nonviolent tactics so much and, you know, negotiation, I only speak for myself. I know views within Russian, you know, movements, Russian pro-independent and indigenous movements on that. They vary. Some, you know, believe that the only way to deal with Russia is violence and an uprising. You know, I respect that point of view. Some believe in that, but I'm a firm supporter of nonviolence myself. And I think that's where, you know, the decolonization debate comes in, because, well, let's remember India, but let's also remember the civil rights movement struggle in the United States. You know, we also have a lot to learn from that.
Thank you very much, Leyla. I think people forget that the independence in India wasn't just one with nonviolence, and it was Gandhi was obviously the famous figure, but there was a lot of violence as well. You know, there was centuries of resistance to British colonialism, a lot of which was violent, and probably necessarily so. So that's I think it's right what you say, that, you know, it does depend a bit on the circumstances. So thank you, Leyla. I don't know if Ridvan is your connection better now? Can we hear from you again?
I just wanted to say that, like, it's different category. You can use, for some people, you can use a form of like a traditional form of colonization as it happened in Africa for instance, in Russia. Definitely like a total isolation, total control over these people. But some people are not. So it's really different categories of colonization or its forms. For instance, we can speak about that Ukrainians were colonized, but compare them with some other nations, small nations in Russia, it would be a mistake in my opinion, because it is like a general form of colonization, but it has some specificities, you know, it has some differences. For instance, Russians or Russian Empire or Soviet Union almost never engaged into the process of political decision-making small nations, like neither Tatars, of course, in the regions or autochthon regions, they used. But if we speak about the highest level of political military leadership, nobody from the Crimean Tatar or Tatars haven't achieved some kind of success in the Soviet Union. But regarding like some different nations, it had a place. It had a place, and so that's why sometimes it's it's the form of colonization. It's different, but in general, you can say definitely that colonization happened in the Eastern Europe, for instance, towards the Belarusians or Ukrainians. It's definitely had a place, definitely.
Thank you, Ridvan. And you make a very good point, actually, that colonization doesn't come in one form. It comes in many different forms. And it's not just the thing with what Russia is doing with using different nationalities, privileging some over others sometimes, maybe the other way around. You know, that happens in pretty much all colonial empires. If you take the British, for example, we talk about Indians in one context as being repressed, but actually they were used often, a lot of them were moved to places like Uganda or wherever, where they were used as part of the British colonial bureaucracy and actually given privileges vis-a-vis the locals. So, there are lots of really complicated things going on with with imperialism, both the kind of classical 19th century kind and the kind we're seeing now with Russia. So that stuff is nothing new, and it's definitely something that's going on with Russia. I mean, as sitting here in Georgia, I mean, the most obvious example is Stalin, right? Stalin was a Georgian, and yet he was one of the greatest Russian imperialists in history. So and to make a more moderate example from that, in the UK, some of the politicians in the really Conservative Party who are most anti-immigration, who are most about, I guess what you would call a kind of modern colonialist mindset, are actually people who are some of them are descended from those communities. So, for example, Suella Braverman, who was the Home Secretary of the government which just fell in the UK just now, was one of the most extremist anti-immigration and Home Secretaries in history. So, like. And believed in shipping off people by plane to Rwanda to sit in concentration camps, effectively. So and a lot of those people come from those sort of communities historically. So it's really complicated, and so thanks for that point. And yeah, and I thanks for answering my question. I guess all three of you. They were both. So yeah, are there any other questions from the audience? Does anyone want to raise their hand and ask an additional question? I can see there was a sort of comment in the comments, which I will read out, but first I'll ask if anyone has a kind of question they want to pose themselves. Okay, so I'll read out the comment from Misha. So it's not so much a question, but more of an observation. There are multiple groups that are suffering both so-called Western and Russian colonialism at the same time. For example, Yupik and Aleut people, or did in the past, as the Great Game comes to mind. Of course, the USSR had neo-colonial engagements in Africa too. And yeah, I think that's kind of linked to the points we were just talking about, regards to kind of the lessons of history when it comes to colonialism. And I suppose it comes to mind to me that this could be a way for some of us to kind of reach out to some of these countries, because a lot of these countries that were colonialized by the West are now leaning pro-Russia now. Like if you look at like UN votes or whatever on Crimea or Ukraine generally, like the countries that are most kind of lukewarm about the situation are countries that used to be colonized by the West. So there's a kind of lacking this sort of solidarity. So if we like boost this narrative of decolonization, actually we are in the same situation you were in 50 years ago, that could actually help diplomatically, you know, to broaden support for our causes and for decolonization in the region. But yeah, so in terms of like what Misha wrote, do any of you have any comment about Western and Russian colonialism, or any of these other comparisons? The Great Game, for example, or anything else? And also, yeah, if anyone wants to ask a question, that's still open. So if anyone wants to raise their hands, that's also fine. I guess my feeling is there's no more sort of real questions. So maybe we can go. We can kind of give all three of our speakers a kind of concluding remarks, you know, for a few minutes, based on like what we've heard today. You know, I guess I suppose I will add something a little bit here as my own question again, and abuse my position. Like I was criticized by Leyla quite rightly for asking a question that was far too academic. So I'm going to go the opposite extreme and ask a really activist question. What do we do? You know, what can we do? We're all sitting in different countries and different places. You know, how do we help each other? You know, as peoples in not the same, different, but also linked situations. How do we use decolonization? How do we promote decolonization of our region ourselves? What should we do? What can we do?
If I may go first, I think the answer is very simple. We need to learn about each other. And, you know, I think that's how colonies function, right? Like within Russia. And when, you know, I as a Tatar think about Russia's neighborhood, a lot of people do not know anything about, you know, cultures of other peoples, because we have all been fed so much Russian culture and Russian language that everything else is forgotten. You know, I mean, of course, here, you know, we have a very educated group of people, an exceptionally, you know, educated audience. But on the grand scale of, you know, things, people don't know much about languages, you know, which groups they are, histories, cultures, etc. And, you know, it seems like a very small and unimportant thing when we have, you know, a literal war going on. But at the same time, you know, it's very easy and it starts right there. And, you know, I guess another thing is just, you know, helping each other and amplifying each other's voices. I'm incredibly grateful that today we have this platform, and thank you for inviting us to talk about our cultures. And honestly, we just need a little bit more on that. We need to ensure that, you know, when, and we spoke about the collapse of the USSR, that when the next great collapse happens, we don't repeat the same mistakes. And that, you know, there is a fair decision making, and that there is a plurality of voices. You know, we do need to push this academic, activist, any kind of discussion to completely next level, you know, and it needs to be theoretical as well as practical. We need to talk about things, talk them through, and also talk about the uncomfortable things. As I mentioned, you know, there are different views on what needs to happen, and we can only, you know, come up with a good plan to combat Kremlin's imperialism if we work together and we are very open about what we want to see. But I think, you know, one thing we all align on, and here it doesn't matter which ethnicity you are, we do want to see democracies on regional level in Russia. Whatever those regions will be, we will see. But that's, you know, our main goal is to, you know, partition with this, because with democracy stops, at least it's some kind of step to ending colonial mindsets as well, you know, once you know that your voice is being heard. So that'll be it from me.
Thank you very much, Leyla. And yeah, I mean, what you say is really important in terms of like so many of these. And I think some of us from say places like Georgia or whatever in Ukraine might have known this 30, 40 years ago when there was no independence, and people said, "Where's Ukraine? Where's Georgia? Where isn't that in America?" You know, and like I think for people like say for example Bashkortostan or Kalmykia, you know, if you said someone in the average European capital city, even amongst intelligent people, you know, who are educated and know, you know, do you know there's like a Buddhist state in Europe? No, is, you know, it's European, which has just raising awareness that the exists. Still, oh, is the internet gone? Oh dear. Can you hear me? Can you hear me still? Sorry,
we are losing your voice, Aleko, because of the internet connection. I guess.
Yeah, I think is it better now? I think it's slightly improved again. Has it? Can you hear me? Yes. Sorry. Yes. So what I was saying is just really important that we sort of listen to the voices of people from countries where people haven't heard of. So I was saying if you go to Europe, you mentioned Bashkortostan, you mentioned Kalmykia, you know, a Buddhist place in Europe. You know, most people in Europe don't know that there's a Buddhist country in Europe. You know. That there is, you know, and the fact is just raising the voices of people like yourself, and that just raising the fact that places exist and need to be defended is really important. So thank you for that point, because really, and we need to help each other on that and have, for example, when we talk about Ukraine, and sometimes we're privileged in Georgia that they talk about Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. But we should not be talking there. We should talk about Belarus, make sure they don't get left behind. Talk about Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, talk about all these places in the same breath. I think we all have a responsibility to do that. So thank you very much for that point, Leyla. Whichever one of Ridvan and Katsiaryna wants to make their kind of concluding remarks. Yeah. Which one of you wants to go first?
Sorry,
yeah,
I think please. Katsiaryna, please.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I have 2 cents to add. I would say that the decolonization of Russian Empire is long overdue, and I think that the current war shows what is the cost of the international community sort of turning a blind eye on or sort of diminishing the threat or playing like trade-offs and games with a power that has malicious intent and has this sort of ever-growing geopolitical appetite. What I mean by that is, let's say, German government now is very much frustrated with their previous years of too mild policy towards Russia, and the way, again, they were turning a blind eye on the neighbors. When the German society is now shocked, looking at the atrocities and the threats that come out of current Russian sort of appetites. And here is another question: what happens? What is the relevance of the UN structure? And what we're gonna do, again, we as international community with P5 and the aggressors being sort of in the P5, like being a member of P5, and like, are we having another League of Nations moment? What happens again? Are we at the like one step away from yet another world war? We're going nuclear, something that, like, again, the humankind has been like dreading about for decades, really hoping it's not going to happen. Yeah, again, like, I'm trying to sound like more optimistic today, but I can't. I think I'm just raising all these like caveats and concerns. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Thanks, Katsiaryna. Sorry, your sound's a little bit cut, but I think we got most of that, so that's okay. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's definitely this sort of nervousness, isn't there, amongst all of us, that we're going to be sold, you know, on the bargaining table. You know, there's big nuclear, you know, threats, you know, at the moment, all of these horrible things happening in big politics, and sort of this feeling that, you know, maybe we'll just be, you know, bargaining chips somehow. So that's, you know, it can be depressing, but yeah, it's important. So I think we've got just Ridvan left to make a concluding remark. Hopefully your internet's good still.
Yeah, I hope to. So I should again, returning to the first question, should Russia be decolonized? It is, I don't know, maybe it's going to be, sounds wild, but I grew up as a black, in terms of the more reality, I was isolated, my people were isolated, no normal job from the very beginning when we returned to Crimea. In many cases, when I compare my people with, I am not so black, so I'm not so black, but the comparison, or like a social place which was put to us from the very beginning, it was like a almost some very racist, I would compare. So, and after when I left Crimea, I was asking myself, should we be against Russians like a tough, or it's like a misconception of my emotions or something like that. But when I heard from my relatives and so on, my friends, that openly people saying, you are Tatars, you are supporting Ukraine, we will take your homes. No, it's openly was said. Sooner you are going to be deported, and we are going to take your homes, as once we took homes during the Second World War. And I think this mindset should be changed. It really should be changed. Otherwise, it doesn't work, in my opinion. But if what I said from the very beginning, if this Russian nationalism is going to win, we would have big troubles, because these kind of people would be really like a brave and would consider that we have a future, not you are having future. So something like that. So I think it should be concentrated. I agree with Leyla that it's maybe it's some kind of platform, because in Poland in the 20s and 30s was organized some kind of Prometheism movement. Polish government was supporting like a general trend of small people in Eastern Europe and even Western Siberia to conduct joint policy. But now what I see, it's like a very chaotic, some events, some movements, some discussions, or we, for instance, participating in such discussion. But it should be, like a channel. Okay, and thank you again for invitation, Alexander.
Thank you, Ridvan. I mean, you make some good points. I mean, actually, the racism, we haven't used that word so far, actually, in our conversation today, and it's interesting you bring it up, because I think it's part of it. Westerners don't really understand the dynamic. They don't see this, where's the racism, but actually, race is a big problem in Russia, and it's an incredibly racist society in many ways. And, if you just look at who's being sent to the front in Ukraine, you can see visually that they look different from what people imagine Russians to look like, and obviously, some people like, Crimean Tatars or even Georgians or whatever, when they go west, people don't really understand the visual difference, but Russians do. Russians know who is a Russian and who's not, and maybe less applicable to Belarusians, but like definitely for Tatars, for people from the east, like Sakha or whatever, they look very different, and people from the Caucasus as well actually look maybe less different from the Western eye, but for the Russian eye look very different and act different, and are therefore subject to the same kinds of racial discrimination that Westerners would associate with, say, for example, African Americans or Asians or whatever. So it's a subject that we've got to right at the end, but it's something that's important. So thanks, Ridvan, for bringing that up as well. So I guess that's the end of our discussion today. All three of you, thank you very much for very, very interesting contributions, and I think we've had a very interesting discussion here today. For those of you watching either here on Zoom or on YouTube later or on Livestream, thank you very much for coming. And we at EDSN obviously do these events rather regularly, so definitely watch our space on Facebook, Twitter, so on and so forth, and we will keep you informed of other interesting and hopefully also controversial, hopefully to some extent, discussions that will happen in future on subjects like this. So watch this space. And yeah, thank you very much for coming. And thank you all three of you once again.
Thank you for having us.